So, how do you add gravitas to your libertarian New Age fable? Why, by instrumentalizing the Holocaust, of course, and that's what we're here for today. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to The Downfall of Dan Simmons, a series where I look at the science fiction books of American writer Dan Simmons to show how he turned into a right-wing nut job, to put it mildly. And this is part 4, where we'll look at the Rise of Endymion, part 4 of the Hyperion Cantos, or part 2 of the Endymion, Rise of Endymion doublet, depending on how you want to look at things. This will be sort of full spoilery. I'll give a very, very quick plot synopsis, and then we'll look at some of the major things going on here, and I'll try to then situate the book in the ongoing downward spiral of Dan Simmons. So, buckle in. It can only get worse. The plot. Alright, the plot is very simple, and I assume at this point that you have read, or at least looked at plot summaries of Endymion, and possibly also Hyperion and the Fall of Hyperion. So, what happens this time around? Well, basically, our good guys are hopping from one world to another and then to a third place before, Aeneas, the Messiah, gives herself up for a sacrifice, and through that sacrifice lifts all of humanity up to a new plane of being, or at least awareness. All the way she is, persecuted by spaceships of the evil church called the Pax, which are, in truth, run by, computers and artificial intelligences and pseudo-terminators, sort of. Alright, there we go. That's sort of all that happens. But let's look at some of the details and what this book does by going from one place to the next. And I'll go through Aeneas' worlds before we look at the church. Part 1, Old Earth. See, a lot of this is nostalgia for Old Earth, so it makes a lot of sense that Aeneas and Roll and Apetic hang out in a reconstructed 20th century, 1950s, sort of 40s, with a reconstructed Frank Lloyd Wright to learn how to be an architect. Well, Aeneas does, while the rest is just hanging out. And, well, this will be important, I feel, for the rest of this book, because Frank Lloyd Wright, apart from being a lot of other things, and obviously a very, very talented architect, is something of a weird, I don't want to say new age, but certainly more spiritual, or, well, almost new age kind of guy in a lot of ways. So that sets the tone already. But we start out this series of this book with Frank Lloyd Wright's reconstructed body dying and everyone dispersing. Aeneas sends off Roll to pick up their spaceship, and will follow later, and they'll decide to meet up on a place called the Mountains of Heaven. Before that, however, Aeneas, who is now 16, confesses her love to Roll, our narrator, who is 32, and they share a first kiss. Yeah, I'm sure there's a name for someone traveling with a 12-year-old child until she turns 16 to then start something of a relationship. I'm pretty sure there is. From there on, we get a bit of, Roll jumping worlds. He's paddling down that world river and goes through different worlds, sees how the Pax is controlling some of them, goes into like another place, meets some really cool people that are sort of color-coded and looking for like a new plane of awareness and being better humans, which are clearly the good guys because the church is harassing them. And he flies through a gas giant and is spat out on the planet where they left the spaceship, where he takes a spaceship and flies to the Mountains of Heaven, our next big place. The Mountains of Heaven are a cool planet with lots of mountains and acid seas below them, so people live on those mountains, and each of those mountains is sort of their own kind of culture. But Aeneas hangs out with the Buddhists, to be precise, with the ones that follow the Dalai Lama, because of course we do have a Dalai Lama in the 13th century, and she's there rebuilding a temple. Everything's really cool, and yeah, the choice of Buddhism does make a lot of sense here, because once again, this is sort of a New Age kind of story, and a lot of like Western New Age mysticism and self-improvement and whatever, took hints from East Asian cultures, whether it's Hinduism or religions, whether it's Hinduism or Buddhism, meditation techniques, all of that stuff. It kind of started back in, say, technically it starts with Theosophy in the 19th century, and Helena Blavatsky thinking that, all the wise guys come from Tibet or India or whatever, but it really caught on during the hippie era in like the 1960s and early 70s, and then once all of those people got jobs and became like really became corporate assholes, they kind of took all of that stuff on into the corporate New Age movement that we found later on. So yeah, of course it's Buddhism and nothing else. But Mountains of Heaven has a different aspect that is also important to keep in mind, and that is other mountains have different cultures. And that's probably for a reason, because all the while this universe that Dan Simmons has described is very culturally monolithic, right? We have all these planets and they are basically copies of very specific romanticized cultures from old Earth in a lot of ways. And the main worlds of the hegemony, where everything mingled into like possibly a new culture, we don't know, was apparently bad and hated because it's sort of supported by the AIs. And we'll come back to that. So on the Mountains of Heaven, we have some Viking mountain where all those warriors are hanging out around Valhalla and all of these places. We also have one where and I'm sorry to say that, Hopi Eskimo culture is hanging out. Yes, Dan Simmons in 1997 thought that using the term Hopi Eskimo is a good idea. Just, keep that in mind, it'll come up later. So they hang out on the Mountains of Heaven until the Pax arrives with a bunch of robots trying to kill Enya. Well, they're obviously androids, and no one knows they're actually robots, and everyone thinks they're people, but it doesn't matter, right? So there's a bit of a firefight, but all the good guys escape on the old spaceship, pick up everyone's favorite good guy Christian, Father Captain DeSoya, and his good guy, very dark-skinned, to put it mildly, officer, corporal, no, he's actually Sergeant Gregorius. So everyone heads off to the next place, which is Libertarian Shambhala. I don't want to call it Nirvana. Libertarian Shambhala is a great place. And this is where Dan Simmons shines, because I said this before, right? Dan Simmons is a master of really cool ideas for world building. This time around, it's a Dyson sphere, but it's also a living tree. And the Ousters, well, the good guys, and some of the Templars that we've met before, and some kind of other, sentient species that have been exterminated by humans on other planets, have, banded together there to build this huge living Dyson sphere where everyone can be themselves on this, higher plane of awareness that we're all striving towards. And Enya is the one to get us there. We'll get there. All right. Once again, this is a really cool place, but it's also very important that, it has these very libertarian vibes. And I'm not necessarily against these, because the idea of, everyone being able to, express themselves in all kinds of ways is good. I approve of it. What happens at this planet, though, is we get some free-fall sex scenes with Rawl and Enya. Luckily, she has aged up to 21, and he's still 32 because of, time dilation and stuff like that, so everything's above board and legal now. Anyway, I could have done without that scene, because it's not necessarily that good. And from then on, the church arrives, shoots down the tree, and Enya and all her friends, except one who goes for a heroic last stand in death, fly on a tree ship back into the galaxy, into the known worlds, and drop off some of their friends on each planet, so we get look-backs and meetings with all kinds of older favorites from the other books, where they all start rebellions against the church. And Enya, Rawl, and Father Captain Desoya end up on Patchem, the church planet, where it is the Thursday before Easter, whose name I always keep forgetting. And the Pope is there washing the cardinal's feet, and they walk in there, and Aeneas goes like, "Yo, Pope!" Gets captured by all these troopers, and everyone else, well, Roll gets captured as well. Roll gets packed off into his gas chamber. Put a pin in there, it'll come back. And Aenea gets tortured by the Technocore and the church, and then gets murdered. But she kind of broadcasts those last scenes to the awareness of all the humans in the galaxy, and they all get that point, and they're like, "Oh shit! Computers are bad, actually, and they have corrupted the church. I guess we need to do something." And they kind of do. And that's sort of the end, almost. There is, of course, the happy end, which is Roll jumps out, casts himself out, because he has now those superpowers, out of his gas chamber, meets up with the good priests, and they fly to Hyperion, pick up Martin Salinas, who is still around, because of course he is, and fly back to Earth, which has magically reappeared in its old spot. And who will be there but Aenea, who has time jumped there, so she can have a kid with Roll and get married in the Catholic rite by Father Captain Desoya. The end. Sort of. Let's look at the church at the same time, because the plot for the church doesn't make a lot of sense. Most of the scenes could be cut. They are there to show that, yes, the Catholic Church is truly evil, because it has been corrupted by the AIs. And there will be a bunch of scenes right now with very disturbing imagery. Some of them could just have been cut. Most of them could just have been cut. All right. So we begin the actual book with a scene where, Lenar Hoyt, Pope Julius the whatever has died, 14th I think, has died, and is obviously resurrected by the cruciform as Father Paul de Rey, who has to die so he can, then be reborn as Lenar Hoyt again. Now, what we get there in that scene is bad. Because in walk a Cardinal and Councillor Albedo from the Technocore, and they kill Paul de Rey. They have a bunch of really bad guy kind of cheesy dialogue, and then you'd think they just shoot him or strangle him or suffocate him or use one of those death ones. No, they cut his throat and drain all his blood into a chalice, which they then enter over him and put into his mouth. Whew. Now, I don't know about you, but have you heard about something called blood libel? And the idea that the Jews do blood sacrifice and ritual murder? Well, keep that in mind. It'll come back later. There's obviously the church torturing people in the old school Inquisition way, which is, I guess we need to know that the Inquisition is bad, so we get a long scene of that. Then we get a scene of the re-election of the new cardinal, of the new pope, which is very long and serves no purpose but to show that there's intrigue in the Vatican. Quelle surprise. And Dan Simmons knows about how popes are elected, which is pretty good, I guess. He's done his reading, he wants to show it off. Good idea. We also get some feelings that the Pax Mercantilis, the trade arm of the church, is trying to become independent and do capitalism all on their own, which the church will not have. There's going to be something here that I think is important to mention. The boss of the capitalist part of the church is coded Japanese, and the style is even called Fuji capitalism, which is racist. Let me back up. During the 80s, late 70s, early 80s, a lot of East Asian countries, especially Japan being sort of the one that everyone had still on their mind because of World War II, and we're slow to forget and whatnot, grew rapidly economically and were sort of at the forefront of capitalism and technology in a lot of ways. And that led to a lot of bad stereotypes. It kind of ends up with a lot of cyberpunk being set in Japan and whatnot. And Dan Simmons just takes that in 1996, 1997, when most of that has already kind of passed, but he's like, yeah, this is Fuji capitalism. And of course the guy is Japanese coded in the 30th century, because we have no imagination how the next, millennium will actually, change us. Point is, the church doesn't like that capitalism becoming more independent, so the Pope says, we got to do something against usury. Now, keep that in mind. The word usury is important. I'm building up to something here. The word usury is, well, I mean, y'all know what it is about. It's about lending money. And the problem is the church using the term usury and restricting usury or accusing people of usury is very much when the Catholic Church was trying to, gang up on the Jews. And I think that's deliberate. Don't worry, we'll have more of that. See, the ousters are evil. We know that. I mean, we know they're good, but the church hates them, so we know they're good. And the technocore is like, we guys, we got to do something against the ousters. This will be the final solution of the ouster problem. Now, I don't know about you, if you've heard about the final solution before. It's not good. It's something my country worked really hard for, so I can't stand for Dan Simmons just taking that away and giving it to some fucking AIs. No, seriously, it's very much coded in that regard. The ousters are good, so attacking them and trying to kill them is coded as a Nazi action. Deliberate Nazi action, hence the use of the word final solution here. And once again, put a pin in there, it all adds up. And this is where things get weird. The technocore is obviously also described as being, parasites, like spiders in the web, manipulating, playing people, using people, which is something that we've heard before in a book that Umberto Eco wrote a really good book about. I'm talking about, Zionist world conspiracy theories and shit like that, just to make it clear. So there's a lot of weird charged imagery here. We also get a scene in a spaceship where a lot of people that are taken into a concentration camp, into a labyrinth in a planet, so the technocore can use them. They have been stunned and put into some sort of stasis, and of course they have barcodes on their skin, because we really make sure that someone gets the note here, right? I don't know. So a lot of symbolism, heavy Holocaust symbolism here, and it doesn't end here. But this is sort of what I wanted to build up to, and now we come to a key scene that makes this book absolutely horrendous, egregious, and terrible, in my opinion. See, part of that whole, New Age thing that Enya is doing is teaching people to hear the voices of the dead, the voices of the living, and then the music of the sphere, and then take a step. So how she does that is by spreading an actual virus with her blood, and they have ceremonies where she puts that blood into a chalice and passes it around. And yes, Jesus Christ, of course, did the same thing, but then the church was taken over after 50 days. So tells Neil Stephenson in Snow Crash, and I'm sure the fact that Snow Crash came out in 1992 has nothing to do with the fact that this is once again, picked up by Dan Simmons. Anyway, point is, when Roll hears the voices of the dead for the first time, we get a bit of a montage that is sort of like a Dune-style drinking the water of life thing, where suddenly we have a first-person narrative of a different scene, and then a different scene, and then a different scene, so we realize that he's actually having these, expressions from all these other places. Perfect, isn't it? So, what's those scenes? Well, one of them is the voices of the living, where you get a flashback to something happening at the Vatican, which is fine. One of them is really understandable. It's a scene between his grandmother and his mother, his dead mother. So that's really cool. And then there's the third, which is in fact the first scene we get. And that is a very long, it's the longest of the three. It's an exhaustingly detailed first-person narrative of a rabbi getting gassed by Nazis in Poland in 1944. And there's no connection to anything else happening in this book. It's just, hey, look, I can do Holocaust fiction. No, you can't, Dan. But I would argue, and this is where we bring this all together, this all follows a larger, pattern. And that's what makes this book stand out and be so bad. See, Dan Simmons has a weird obsession with Jews, and we'll come back to that later, but... And I have to mention this once again, Dan Simmons, as far as I know, is not Jewish in any way. At least he has never said so, and when people ask him about he has also, said yeah, I'm just interested in Jews. So he has a weird interest in Jews. We've seen that with the Scholar's Tale, Saul, Weintraub, and all of that stuff going on in the first book. It kind of comes up again and again, and he's like, yeah, Jews will be around forever. I'm pretty sure they'll get they'll be persecuted all the time. But what he does in Rise of Endymion is he takes the imagery and the symbolism of the Holocaust and of anti-Semitism and empties it of its actual content to then reapply it. Things are coded as Holocaust, as anti-Semitism, as while at the same time using anti-Semitic stereotypes, which, we come back to then signal to us who are the good guys and who are the bad guys and what is really evil and what is really good. And that, I think, is the great issue with this book. It's taking these symbols, reapplying them to send a message. So let's look at it. Who are the good guys? Who are the people that the evil Nazis want to do a Holocaust on? Well, it's apparently the very libertarian Osters. It's apparently, non-believers, that's kind of fair. And it's apparently, the capitalists, because they're apparently the Jews now. That's kind of fucked up, isn't it? And then, at the same time, who are the Nazis? Well, the Nazis are the technocore. It's very clear. They talk about final solutions together with the church. They do all of that stuff. They do the Holocaust. But then again, those guys do blood sacrifice. Dare I say blood libel? Well, they do that. Those guys hide. They are parasites. He explicitly calls them parasites. They are, like spiders in the web, manipulating everyone in humanity. And do you remember in Hyperion when they kind of fabricated that postmodern culture where all those cultures blended together instead of being properly ethno-nationalist on their mountains? Yeah, that's all of those guys. So he does code those guys. He calls them out, the Nazis, and then uses all the anti-Semitic stereotypes he can come up with to apply to those guys as well, because he doesn't fucking care about the actual content and actual meaning of those tropes, of those stereotypes, of those narratives and images. He just wants the emotional effect of those and then reapply them to make sure that we find out who the true victims and the true persecutors are. And that is pretty fucking atrocious. And I think that's where we actually come to the sort of end. Dan Simmons has always been conservative. In Hyperion and Fall of Hyperion, we very much talk about the Western canon that made us who we are in a lot of ways, and how that stuff is great. In Endymion, we talk about how no one reads those books anymore, and books are actually banned, and the truth is actually banned. Obviously, the books Hyperion and Fall of Hyperion in world are also banned because they're telling the truth and part of these, ongoing Western canon. It's a very Western Anglophone canon that is obviously not everything that ever happened to human culture. And now we're moving on to the next step where we're reapplying those symbols to make sure that people that actually read books are the good guys, follow capitalism, libertarianism, and the Western canon are sort of seen as the rebels who are treated like the Jews in a Holocaust. And, that's a method that we've seen again and again, that we've seen just last year when people on Twitter said they were treated like Jews because they spouted transphobic nonsense. It's been around it's a tactic of the radical right for a long time to cast themselves as the true Jews, just doing exactly that thing, emptying the meaning of something as uniquely tragic as the Holocaust to then reapply to themselves and cast themselves as the victims. And it's 1997, which is where this kind of stuff starts to happen in, political and cultural discourse. And I think that's sort of what we need to take away from this book. The other part is the free speech part. See, Dan Simmons' stand-in in these books is Martin Salinas, who is foul-mouthed, but he's telling the truth as much as he can. And that's apparently something we need to feel good about. So it's totally fine that Martin Salinas calls someone a 20th century welfare queen here. And I'm like, yeah, don't do that. But we're supposed to oh, isn't he a champ using all these old-fashioned insults? No, that's a racist stereotype, motherfuckers. Stop doing that. And let's end this all with another thing. And I think that's part of part of this like very conservative bit. It's like disregard and insensitivity. It's like, yes, you can do that. You're not going to get book banned or anything for writing these books, Dan Simmons, but maybe think about whether this shit is hurting people. And that's why he goes out and, pulls out the Hopi Eskimos and doesn't care about that. He calls Fuji capitalism. That's why he just, bakes in another magical android. Yeah, that's the final thing we need to talk about. See, for reasons that are not necessarily important to the plot at all, there are always other intelligences out there that have already reached that next plane of awareness. And those alien things, which may or may not be AIs or something else, have sent people among us to observe us, to judge us worthy of, joining them. Which is, fine so far. But who you guess is that guy? Could it be any of our characters? Well, of course it can. It is the blue-skinned android who has this ongoing chattel slave analogy going on for the first book of Endymion. It's abedic, of course it is. And he's a magical blue-skinned entity. So I can't call him a magical Negro because technically he's a magical android, but it's still like, hey, let's just use this because I don't care if it hurts anyone. And it's that combination of like flagrant disregard in favor of free speech, using all these stereotypes just to, because you can. That's the first step. And the next step is, if I can do that, then I can reapply the emotional hit those stereotypes, those narratives have to my own political and philosophical ends. And that's what we see in Rise of Endymion, as the final step of that first phase of Dan Simmons' science fiction writing. We're using the Holocaust to make a point about how capitalism is actually good. And that's kind of fucked up. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this nevertheless. If you disliked what I said, well, give it a dislike or just argue with me in the comments. I would appreciate that. If you enjoyed this, still argue with me in the comments. Like, share, subscribe. I really appreciate that. We're so close to 1,000 subscribers. That would be great. And if you really want to support me in a monetary way, I hate begging, but I'd really appreciate it if you want to join the Patreon. We can work on the Patreon to make it even cooler. Right now it's kind of languishing, but I have ideas. We can do stuff. I might just drop unfinished videos to ask your opinions on it and stuff like that. Just saying. But mostly, I'm really happy that you stayed with me this long. Thanks for the support. And see you in the next time. Cheers.